into apparently a new Cold War and a very hot war going on with Russia and various other issues. I personally am disappointed. Do you share my sense that the world missed an opportunity?
Oh, absolutely. And unfortunately, I blame the United States government and leadership and political system for a lot of that. A lot of Americans don't like me saying that, but that has been my biggest disappointment over 30 years, which is a wealthy, powerful, capable country just did not rise to the occasion. And I saw it then, and for me, the disappointments mounted from then. I'm really unhappy about U.S. foreign policy now, but that has been a growing feeling over more than 30 years. It's strange. Of course, the U.S. is just one of 193 countries, and we're just 4.1% of the world's population. So people may say, well, isn't it really a little ridiculous to put so much weight on the U.S.? And I think there are two answers to that. One is, well, I'm an American, so I judge our own situation first, no doubt. But second, the U.S. believes itself to be, describes itself to be, and in some ways is a special country in the mix, in that it's very powerful, very rich, very influential. And it's in that particular sense that I think we should have just done a lot better than we've done. And why I feel down on the U.S. approach to the world, and even regard it as very dangerous.
Yeah, I think for people who weren't around then, it may be hard to imagine how much influence and power the U.S. had. And I've always thought that at that point we had great norm shaping power. I've made the case to people, and they're almost always skeptical, that if we had really made it our mission to establish the norm of complying with international law by talking about it and complying with it ourselves, I think that could have been had a real influence on the direction of events. Of course, it would have meant that we did a whole lot of things differently than we've done. Does that seem crazy to you?
Well, I've always thought that there were two essential parts to a decent world. One is that the rich countries would be generous and help the poor countries to get out of their poverty, and in no small part because in some broad sense, the rich countries had imperialized or colonized much of the low-income world, and so there was not just a sense of responsibility of the rich to the poor, but a sense of historical accountability as well. The second thing that I thought was, and I believe to be crucial, is that we get along with each other through dialogue and diplomacy rather than war. So those are the two dimensions that I think are needed to shape a decent world. The world's divided between the rich and the poor, and the world is just armed to the teeth in each other's face, and with a hot war now raging in Ukraine. So my experience is the United States was anything but generous with the rest of the world. It was so stingy, in my experience, it has shocked me and dismayed me for more than 30 years, and it's gotten worse over time. And the United States is really militaristic in its foreign policy approach. We talk about all those terrible things other countries do. Of course, Russia's top of list right now, but we seem not to be able to grapple with our own relentless militarism. I'm now 68. The U.S. has been at war virtually every year of my life, and most of it in wasteful wars of choice that were incredibly destructive and incredibly misguided. So, yes, I'm not only frustrated, I'm rather alarmed right now because we speak casually about this terrible set of events in Ukraine without appreciating how close we are to the nuclear threshold. And that's no panic or no craziness. That's actually reality that you learn in being involved in international diplomacy over decades. There just are a lot of reckless, stupid people around that could do profound damage to the world. And so anytime there's a hot war raging and this kind of venomous talk vis-a-vis Russia without any dialogue going on, it's very frightening.
What would you say was the first kind of big mistake? I mean, if you just had to, when did you first think things were going awry in a fundamental way in terms of U.S. foreign policy?
Oh, I know it. It was November 1991, and I remember the moment also, but because I was in a very unusual circumstance. I was the leading external advisor to the Solidarity Movement and to Poland's first post-communist government. I had more of a front row seat than you can even imagine because I was involved in the core issues of democratization, of the end of the Cold War, and of economic strategy. And I had an incredible experience. We don't have time to go into it at length, but for some time, I'd make a recommendation about what to do, and within hours, the U.S. government adopted it. I thought, gee, that's pretty cool. I created a stabilization fund for Poland in September 1989, typed out the proposal in the morning, and by the evening, the White House confirmed $1 billion to help stabilize the Polish currency. So I thought, gee, this is a role. The U.S. is being constructive. It's being forthcoming. The program that I recommended for Poland stabilized the country. It restored economic growth to a collapsed economy within 18 months, enabled Poland to have its best 30 years of growth in its history, and to join the European Union, and so on. Okay, that was good. Then in 1990 and 91, the Soviet Union, President Gorbachev's economic team asked me for some advice based on what was happening in Poland. And I gave it, and I worked on a project to help provide financial backing to Gorbachev's reforms in the spring of 1991. And they were flatly rejected by the White House. And I thought, my God, this is stupid. Here you have the it's not even once in a generation, once in a century opportunity for peaceful transformation. And you tell Gorbachev, sorry, not a dime. Okay. Then when Gorbachev went home empty-handed from a G7 summit, he faced a putsch. He was kidnapped, in effect, and he spiraled down in power, and it was the end of the Soviet Union, in effect. Then came Yeltsin as president of Russia and what would soon be an independent Russia. And his economic team called me and said, please hurry to Moscow to the dacha to discuss economic strategy. And I did. And I saw that Russia was without foreign exchange reserves. It was facing a fulminant economic crisis. It was like having, a heart attack on the table, or you needed defibrillator or some absolutely urgent response. And the G7 countries, led by the United States, the most powerful 7 countries of the world, which at that time controlled about 50% of world output, sent the finance deputies, so-called, basically the number 2s of the treasuries and finance ministries, to Moscow in November 1991. And I said to the acting prime minister, you need a debt standstill. That means you need to tell them, look, don't make me pay debt right now. I have no reserves. I can't go broke. I can't afford a hyperinflation. And I thought, this is just about the most transformative moment in modern history. Of course they're going to accept this. They're going to say, what can we do for you? This is so crucial. And I remember Yegor Gaidar walking out,
and who was that?
Yegor Gaidar was the acting deputy premier and the chief economic advisor of Yeltsin. And after the briefing, he went into the room with the G7 deputies, and the meeting ended, and he walked out ashen-faced. I said, what happened? He said, they rejected every proposal flat out. They said, you continue to pay every penny due, or we turn the food aid on the high seas around, and so forth. Okay, that's the moment, Bob. For me, now, I could not believe what I heard, because I know a lot of history. I knew a lot of U.S. stupidity. I had lived through it. But I thought, this can't be right. So I spent basically the next 18 months doing anything I could try to do to mobilize some kind of positive response and support for a democratic, peaceful market reform in Russia. And Washington was absolutely without a response. And I had just gone through this with Poland with completely the opposite results. And I did not understand truly the geopolitics.
Do you understand them now? Now, first of all, this was the first Bush administration still?
This was the end of the Bush administration, and then the same thing happened in the first year of the Clinton administration.
What was the source of resistance ideological? I mean, you wouldn't expect a ton of ideological continuity between the two. I mean, although, of course, the U.S. foreign policy establishment tends to be a more or less constant thing. But
it is a deep thing. This is a truth. It's a deep thing. It's not dependent so much on who's president. In fact, you sometimes wonder if the presidents really have much role in it at all.
But is this fiscal conservatism?
No.
What is going on?
No, what's going on is that the United States already decided now we're going to be the sole superpower of the world, and Russia is going to basically just have to be cut down to size. But we're certainly not going to take any heroic measures to sustain Russia as a viable potential threat to us. And so Russia's an enemy still, or a threat. It's a competitor.
Don't you think if you had asked the first George Bush, if you had asked Bill Clinton, they would have said, and I think meant it, we want to integrate Russia into the West. I mean, it was still the Soviet Union.
Yes, that's
for a while.
Correct.
Then it became
we want to integrate them into a U.S.-led system.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
But it seems to me to fail to appreciate the delicacy of the challenge actually entailed in integrating Russia into the West is really malpractice. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's like, it was a big challenge. I mean, it's like this, you're taking a command economy, a formerly totalitarian system. You've got all these kind of, you might say, psychological issues. They're adjusting to suddenly not being considered one of the world's 2 superpowers. You would ideally like them to move in a democratic direction. I don't think that's truly a prerequisite for world peace, as some people do, but you like it. I mean, there's a lot going on there. It just seems to me hard to imagine that they didn't say, we need some task forces. We need the world's greatest minds figuring out how we're going to accomplish this. They just thought it will happen naturally.
And they didn't. They didn't, period. The idea started in 1992 under Bush 1 with Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Cheney, that this is now the time for the U.S. to lead the world, to be the global hegemon. That was the idea. For Clinton, the idea was, I don't know what. Presidents don't understand much anyway in the first year or two of their administrations, and Clinton was certainly like that. But they said no heroics. You know, it's domestic politics anyway, no heroics. And so, no, nothing of a big, ambitious scale was done. That was what I believed in because I knew enough of history I knew a lot of history, I have to say, of the end of World War I and the disasters that ensued, and the end of World War II and the constructive approach that had ensued. And I wanted this to be a constructive approach. But the U.S. already had decided in 1992, this is going to be a U.S.-led world. We're going to start expanding NATO. Russia is, going to be a bit player. We just have to make sure the nukes don't go off. But other than that, we don't have to pay too much attention. And of course, they had no conception of how China was going to rise during this period. But what I would say in brief is that from 1992 until today, the U.S. grand strategy has been to be the top dog with no rival. And of course, it's a ridiculous idea compared to the idea of a decent world that cooperates and that tries to overcome poverty and that faces climate change and so forth. The U.S. grand strategy is not about ending climate change. It's not about economic development. It's not about ending poverty. It's not about peace. The U.S. grand strategy is that the United States needs to be the predominant country in the world, period. And we have two rivals in this vision. One is the big one, China, and the other one is what they think of as a kind of sideshow, but it's not quite a sideshow. It's 11 time zones, and it's a country with 1,700 deployed nuclear weapons, and we're at war with it. That's Russia. And the U.S. view is, no, this is the U.S. world. And that is in both parties. In the Republican Party, it was the Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz world. In the Democratic Party, it's been the Democratic Party neocons. By the way, Victoria Nuland, our Undersecretary of State, Lincoln, Jake Sullivan, and Biden. They've been part of that all along.
Are you saying they all deserve the label? This is a technical issue, neocon, or you're just saying that it's more or less the same foreign policy, whatever you call it?
A little bit of both. But, when I say it, people are shocked. Jeff, what are you talking about? How could you call Biden a neocon? A congressman just basically took my head off a little bit for saying that. But the fact of the matter is, look, Biden, Nuland, and Sullivan were part of the overthrow of the Ukrainian president in 2014 that really started this war in its violent phase. So yes, they've been part of the idea that what's really at stake is a U.S.-led world. For me, it doesn't compute. What's really at stake, in my view, is a cooperative world operating under the UN Charter and taking steps to end poverty and fight climate change and other environmental disasters. But it's a very different view. Basically, most of Washington is organized around the U.S. must lead view. And it's out of date. It's anachronistic. It was wrong in 1992. It's wildly out of date today because it's no longer even based on a U.S. economic or technological predominance, given China's rise. So it gets more and more dangerous every day because it's completely out of sync with ground reality.
Yeah. Well, your reference to the UN Charter is what I had in mind when I said there was hope of international law maybe actually being respected. I was thinking in particular the ban on transborder aggression and in the charter, but on the issue of where the impetus for this foreign policy comes from, let me challenge you a little in the sense that, as you know, in the 90s, there were leading lights of the foreign policy establishment who said NATO expansion is a terrible idea. Yet Clinton did it. Now, one thing I've heard is that as the 96 election approached, he very much wanted to nail down some votes from people of Eastern European descent in the Midwest, whatever. I've heard, knowledgeable people say that. But that was a moment when there certainly wasn't consensus in the foreign policy establishment for NATO expansion. And yet it happened. I agree with you. It was a mistake. And in general, one could go through and point to ways specific domestic issues have warped U.S. foreign policy. But anyway, you hold to the view that in the, quote, deep state, I mean, maybe you want to avoid that phrase. Actually, I'd probably advise you to avoid it. But you know what I mean? You go ahead.
Actually, it is a historian that I can't name because he hasn't come out with this yet, was telling me recently that in his archival work, he has uncovered documents already in 1992 with the list of countries to which NATO will expand, including Ukraine, 1992. And I'm trying to find right now, if I can, while we talk, an article by, oh yes, this is fascinating, an article by Brzezinski in 1997 in Foreign Affairs magazine. Let me just read a little bit of it quickly. Accordingly, NATO and EU enlargement should move forward in deliberate stages, assuming a sustained American and Western European commitment. Here is a speculative but realistic timetable. By 1999, the first 3 Central European members will have been admitted into NATO. By 2003, the EU is likely to have initiated accession talks with all 3 Baltic republics, and NATO will likewise have moved forward on their membership as well as that of Romania and Bulgaria, with their accession likely to be completed before 2005. Between 2005 and 2010, Ukraine, provided it has made significant domestic reforms and has been identified as Central European country, should also be ready for initial negotiations with the EU and NATO. Well, Bob, that's exactly the timetable. That's not a casual paragraph. Yeah. That is actually officialdom giving us a little bit behind the curtain of what the plans are.
Now, that's Brzezinski in 97. He's 97. No longer in power.
No, he's no longer in power, but he's presenting at Foreign Affairs magazine, which is, the magazine for the New York Council on Foreign Relations people. And my point is this. This is really a long-term strategy. It's Clinton, he went along with it, but it was presented to him, no doubt. It was, and by the way, Bill Perry, like you said, his defense secretary almost resigned over it. He thought it was horrible. George Kennan said this is the biggest mistake of our generation. But it's a deep plan. And it was set in motion, and it's still in motion to this day, even though it has led us to war. That's amazing. Not only has it led us to war, but while we're talking about it on your podcast, the New York Times won't talk about it. The Washington Post won't talk about it. The Wall Street Journal won't talk about it. MSNBC won't talk about it. Nobody will talk about it in the mainstream media.
Yeah. Let me just quickly say, one thing I had heard is that during the Bush 1 administration, voices of reason like Brent Scowcroft actually beat back the neocons on the NATO expansion issue, but ultimately the neocons prevailed. There was some continuity of personnel, and and so on. Of course, Brzezinski, not a neocon really, but he has his own issues with Russia, God knows. You mentioned the media. Is it my
It's interesting, just in terms of continuity, consider Victoria Nuland. She's our Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs.
She was in the Cheney.
Exactly. She was a Cheney National Security Advisor. Then she was the U.S. ambassador to NATO under Bush. Then she was the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, and her call was intercepted as she planned the post-Yanukovych government because she was deeply involved in the overthrow of Yanukovych. Now she is Undersecretary of State, and she's married to the leading author, ideologue of liberal hegemony, as he calls it, Robert Kagan. So that's continuity, by the way. That is literal continuity of one person across both parties going back now almost 20 years.
Quick 30-second anecdote. When the Obama administration brought her on, I was running a blog at the point called The Progressive Realist, and we ran an item saying, wait, what's going on? She's like a neocon. She was plotting with Cheney, and Obama is bringing her on board. We were pilloried across the foreign policy establishment. Left, right. How dare you, question, like what? Just because she's married to Bob Kagan? Well, no, it was deeper than that. But the point is, everyone in the blob rallies round everyone else in the blob. And
that's it. This is deep. This is really deep. And it's got a lot of continuity. And the continuity now is extremely dangerous because it's so anachronistic. We don't understand to this moment that we think we're leading the world parade, but 80% of the world saying, huh? What? Who are you to lead the world parade? We've got, yes, the US, Canada, Britain, European Union, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. That's our list. Okay, that's a list that is 15 to 20% of the world population. And the rest of the world, like President Lula, who was just in China, and the Saudis, and you name it, because they were just with China also, and China just brokered a peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The rest of India, the rest of the world saying, no, the U.S. isn't our leader, but we'd like to get along with you. And that's where we have this basic discontinuity right now. And we keep pushing NATO. And it just doesn't make sense.
Now, Jeff, I know you've got a hard out, as they say in the business, like right now. So if you don't have time to answer this, just don't, or give it a one-word answer. But is it my imagination, or you mentioned the media? Has the media actually gotten worse in some sense? I mean, it always
without question.
Well, and how would you characterize that? And
without question. So and by the way, I will tell you, when Nord Stream was blown up, I had a chat with a longtime friend and actually a classmate of mine from Harvard from decades ago, who was a senior reporter in one of the most important newspapers. I said, you know what? I think the U.S. did it. And he said, of course the U.S. did it. Who else? And I said, maybe your paper could mention something like that. And just today said the Russians did it. He said, come on, Jeff, come on. I said, are you kidding? Could we have a serious discussion of this? And he said to me, the editor's not so interested in that. And I said, this is a friend from decades. I said, when I was young, I turned to your newspaper because of Watergate, because of the Pentagon Papers, and I loved it. And he said to me, that paper is so dead and gone, Jeff. You have to understand that. And I cannot imagine, this is a really talented guy, lead columnist, lead journalist, I should say. And he's telling me the paper that I loved is dead and gone. If you ask me why, I really cannot figure it out, why a paper doesn't want to beat the government over the head when it tells ridiculous stories like Nord Stream was blown up by 6 people on a boat, like they tried for one day. Okay, come on. This was put out by serious media because it was almost a joke from the intelligence agency. Why these media are so in line with official narratives, I don't fully understand. I know all the theories, money, advertising, power, many other things. But the truth is, it's dreadful compared to what it was 40 years ago. Dreadful. And it's gotten a lot worse.
Yeah, I think there are a few factors, but I do think the actual conception of a journalist's mission, what the journalist's conception of their mission is, has in some cases, not all, but actually changed. When
I was young, which is a long time ago, we knew the government lied nonstop. And the idea of journalism was pick out the lies. That was fun. And not fun, only crucial, like the Pentagon Papers in the Vietnam War, like Watergate. And now you don't get any sense of that, because if you're somewhat experienced, and also I'm lucky to have daily conversations with a lot of people who are in the know because of their responsibilities. So I know a lot of what goes on day to day. I don't see any will in the mainstream media to start from the basic proposition that, okay, politicians lie, that's their job, but our job is to the Federal Reserve, for example. Okay, these are technicalities. 25 trillion is still a big number, and it's nearly 100% of our annual output in the country, which is the gross domestic product. Now, back in the year 2000, the debt that was owed by the government was only 35% of the gross domestic product. So it went from being 35% of national income back in the year 2000 to nearly 100% of our national income today. That's a pretty steep increase. That means that we are spending, but not covering that spending by taxes, but covering that spending by borrowing. And obviously, we've been borrowing a lot. The point of my article is that really a lot of that borrowing has gone to fund these useless, wasteful, destructive wars. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, now Ukraine. That's awful. And when you look at the estimates by the Watson Institute at Brown University, they say that the cost of these wars is about $8 trillion if you combine them, not even up to today, but up to a couple of years ago. Now, there are some definitional issues and some timing issues that mean that we should go a little bit deeper at the technical level. But the point is that if we had kept our debt at 35% of GDP rather than at 100% of GDP, that is about 65% of GDP, or 2/3 of today's GDP of 24 trillion. You do the arithmetic, that's about a $16 trillion, $15 to $16 trillion increase of debt beyond what would have kept the debt at a level relative to income. So what the Watson Institute estimates are showing is that about half of that has gone to war. I think even more than half has really accounted for by the military, because in addition to the war spending, we're funding 800 military bases around the world. We're funding a bloated intelligence world. We're funding all sorts of things that the military-industrial complex likes. The Raytheon or General Dynamics or Boeing or those that are selling weapons like, but are a waste for the American people. Now, mind you, the other half of that increase of debt came from the 2008 financial crisis, which blew a hole in the budget. That was Wall Street excess, let me put it that way. Another part came from the pandemic. Various things could be said about that. But basically, between war, financial crisis, and the pandemic, that's where our budget was blown. And here's the challenge I would put to President Biden. I'm completely against what we're doing in Ukraine because I think this war could have been avoided. I think it has a lot to do with the U.S. relentless push to expand NATO, which, by the way, is a military-industrial complex lobbying goal. That's what they lobby for. They love selling weapons to new NATO members. They want to keep expanding NATO. And other countries, including Russia, say, stop coming up to our border. Okay. So I think this war could have been avoided, but Biden really is part of the military-industrial complex, has been as a senator, a vice president, now as president. He's always backed NATO enlargement. He's backed NATO enlargement to Ukraine. I think it's been reckless. I think it's the reason we have this war. So I'm saying, okay, if you really want to make a deal, stop this wasteful spending, get the military budget under control. But by the way, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are talking about this almost at all.
Yes, it's up to us, right?
They're gonna slash the social safety net, which is already in tatters in this country, and then protect the military spending.
Well,
so that we can have more war.
Yeah, this is what I wanted to ask you about, Jeffrey Sachs, because I know that at one point during this debt crisis, Republicans were adamant about reducing spending. We even had our House Speaker, I'll put that in quotes, Kevin McCarthy promised the Freedom Caucus and promised the American people that we would not issue a blank check for Ukraine. And now we're up to over $115 billion. Half of that, an estimated half, for weapons and military training. The latest being that the U.S., Biden has agreed that the United States will train Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16 fighter jets.
Unbelievable, because it's nonstop escalation, more weapon systems, more destruction, more deaths, more spending. And I remember what I wanted to say, which is I would challenge President Biden, if he wants to continue on this path of the Ukraine war, which I think is tragic and completely solvable if he would stop the NATO enlargement and say to the Russians, go home and we don't go into Ukraine. And that's how you end this war. But I'd like him to say, okay, if we're going to spend more money, we're going to raise taxes to do it. Let's put it to the American people. Fund this, not just put it on the debt. And I'd say to the Republicans also, you want the war? Tell the American people they're going to pay more taxes. You want to have a war in Asia with China? Okay, raise the taxes for that. See how the American people feel about that. They don't dare do it. That's why the debt keeps going up, because these wars are not popular at all. And by the way, they don't want to ask the American people their views about anything. So they just put it onto the debt without asking us, do we really want to have this tragic war in Iraq? Do we really want to have a CIA-led operation to overthrow the Syrian government? Do we really want to bomb Libya back into rubble? They never asked us on any of this stuff. And if they just put it onto the debt, but if they said, okay, this is really important, and we're going to raise taxes to do it, then we could have a good debate in this country. Is this really important, or is this good for General Dynamics? Is this good for Boeing? Is this good for the military-industrial complex? We don't have that debate right now because they hide it on the debt.
That's right. And few people realize that the Department of Defense, the Department of War, it used to be called, it should still be called, has never passed an audit. That's because there's missing money and people can't explain where this money has gone. And now we're just hurling money, spending about $6 billion to prop up the government in Ukraine rather than saying, we'll support a ceasefire, we'll sit down, we'll negotiate with Putin, with Zelensky, maybe have 2 tracks of diplomacy, but we want to end this war now. No, instead, Biden has committed the United States to train Ukrainian pilots on these F-16 fighter jets, which could take a year or 2. I mean, that's in essence saying we're committed to further death, destruction, the risk of nuclear war for another 2 years. But let's get back for a minute to the so-called debt crisis, because you're an economist, Jeffrey Sachs. I want answers to a couple of questions in the weeds. Okay. So we have this, you say it's a $24 trillion debt. If you really examine it, the media is saying 31 trillion. Anyway, the point is, where are we getting this money? It's debt. Who do we owe it to? How are we raising this money to pay for all of these wars, including the war in Ukraine?
So the government borrows. It borrows from the public. It borrows from foreign governments that hold this debt. It borrows from foreign wealth holders that owe this debt. And to some extent, the borrowing is okay, but we went from owing 35% of our income to 100% of our gross domestic product. And what the Congressional Budget Office signals is that if we keep on the current policies, the debt will rise to around 160% or even higher of our gross domestic product by mid-century. In other words, we're on an upward spiral because no side, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans, want to talk about spending to cover wars and the military budget. Neither one wants to talk about taxing the rich. By the way, that's true not just of the Republicans who fight that, the Democrats fight that. President Biden announces for re-election, and where does he go immediately? To wealthy donors. He goes to Wall Street. This is both parties. Come on. This is why the rich don't pay taxes. So we're on a spiraling rise of debt. You can carry some debt. We all, carry a mortgage maybe if you own a home. Some people have consumer debt and so forth, but you keep it under a limit so that it doesn't get out of hand. And for a while, the interest rates were very, very low. So the government said, oh, look, we can borrow. It doesn't matter. We'll just keep borrowing. But you know what? It turned into inflation. Now the interest rates are going up because the Fed is once again raising interest rates to try to staunch inflation. And suddenly the debt service burden, in other words, how much we have to pay on just interest on this debt, is rising by percentage points of GDP, eating up invaluable tax revenues that we need to help educate our kids, for normal society, for fighting the pandemics and the mental health and the crime and other things that we have a social safety net for, but it's now going to go to debt service. And that is why you keep your debt under control, so that when you collect revenues, you can use it for the important things, not simply to pay interest on what you borrowed in the past.
Now, when we're paying this interest, Jeffrey Sachs, are we paying this interest to Japan, a large holder of U.S. debt, to China, another large holder of U.S. debt? Did they buy treasury bonds? Is that the debt that we're talking about?
Yeah, we pay the interest on anyone that holds U.S. Treasury bills and bonds. That includes a lot of foreign governments, as you've mentioned. It includes a lot of wealthy people in the United States. It includes a lot of pension funds, insurance funds, money market funds backed up by U.S. Treasury bills. Government borrows by selling its bills and bonds in a kind of open market that any wealth holder can buy to include in their wealth or their asset portfolio. So it's wealth holders all over the world of all kinds, from pension funds and insurance funds and money market funds and foreign exchange reserves of other governments. The point from our governmental point of view is That's okay if it's 35% of GDP, even if it's 50% of GDP. By the way, it's okay if it went up to 100% of GDP and we had used the difference for making wonderful investments that were going to boost the economy. But where did that increase of debt come from? That 16 trillion that I talked about, what was it used for? Was it used for modernizing our infrastructure and making everything work well in the US? No, it went to wars down the drain. It went to the veterans spending for all the wounded soldiers that suffered from this, a huge bill, human disaster, financial and fiscal disaster. It went also for this Wall Street debacle in 2008 when they were playing games with subprime mortgages, and we ended up with a massive recession. And it went to the spending on the COVID pandemic. And so we don't have the infrastructure or the investment, the physical capital, as the counterpart of all that borrowing. We have a lot of waste. It's very sad. We ran up the debt and we have nothing to show for it except, my God, why did we do that?
Well, I think we did it because the capital has really been invaded by lobbyists for military contractors. They're the most powerful, as you mentioned in your article in Common Dreams, the most powerful lobbying group. I imagine the oil industry, fossil fuel industry is right up there as well with big pharma. But by and large, we have a captive Congress. So here's my question. To talk about the debt just a little bit more, with us owing something like over $800 billion in interest to China, how is it that we have all these lawmakers who are saying that we need to prepare for war with China? I was listening to a hearing in the House the other day, and I couldn't believe I couldn't believe what they were saying about sending more and more troops over to the Pacific to surround China. I think we already have about 250 bases. We're opening a new base in Guam, sending 5,000 Marines from Okinawa to Guam, fully militarizing Guam. And yet we owe China money. How do they square this in their mind?
Well, I can tell you I've been engaged in international economics at the professional level for 43 years, and you add some student years in that. I've never seen a worse public discussion and debate than we have right now. It's almost mindless. It's also filled with lies and many other things, but this warmongering against China it's so wrong, by the way. Aside from the question of debt, do we really want to end the world? Do we really want to have World War III with China right now? These congressmen need to get a life, get out of their handouts and hands out to the military industrial funders and the other lobbyists, and go learn something. Go to China, go have some discussions, go see something, because what they're talking is nonsense, and it's going to get us in deep, deep trouble. So when it comes to the question of the drumbeats of war with China, much more than the debt issue and the economy issue, I'm worried about the survival issue. And I just see so much ignorance in Congress, but maybe it's not ignorance. Maybe they're just expert at fundraising for their reelection campaigns, and that's all that matters to them. But I don't think they know what they're talking about at all right now.
Well, I would agree with you on that. I think many of us at Code Pink would agree with you. And there are some of us who believe that this war in Ukraine is really a prelude to what people like Victoria Nuland, number 3 in the State Department, who was there in the Maidan Square in 2014, encouraging the coup and engineered the transition government, want to see, which is the next war with China. God forbid, right? We know that would be an absolute disaster.
Overseas, a lot of people call this the Nuland administration, not the Biden administration, because Nuland has been there. She was Cheney's advisor. She was the Bush ambassador to NATO when the NATO enlargement to Ukraine and to Georgia was put. This disastrous idea that got us into this was put into the NATO agenda by the way, over the huge objections of the Europeans at the time. She was the ambassador to NATO under the Republicans. Okay, then she stays, and then she's the point person for the U.S. role in the overthrow of the Ukraine government in February 2014 that starts this war, because people need to remember, just get on a website and look at it. Even they're admitting it. This war did start in 2022 with Russia's invasion. This war started in 2014 with the violent overthrow of the Ukraine government. And go listen to Nuland on tape several weeks before the overthrow, talking about who the next government would be in Ukraine. She's already plotting this with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, on a phone call that was intercepted. It's unbelievable. She was then Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. Now she's Under Secretary of State for Political Affairs. So she's that deep state, the one that transcends the political parties, that shows this is not Democrats and Republicans. This goes back to Cheney, to Bush. This goes to Obama administration. This goes right up to Biden. Come on. What is this? And we've known all along. Our own diplomats, William Burns, who in 2008 was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, cabled home, and people can find it online because it was covered by WikiLeaks. They can find William Burns' email cable that says, my God, if we push NATO enlargement, this is absolutely a Russian red line. And the Russians have explained, don't do this, why this is so dangerous. And Nuland, okay, close your eyes, just go ahead, everything will be fine. And not everything's fine. Now we're in the middle of one war and at risk of another war, and nothing is fine.
Nothing is fine. I want to ask you, back at the debt, on the topic of the debt, there are those, Jeffrey Sachs, who say, you know what, we don't have to worry about the debt, so-called debt crisis, because our dollar is not backed by gold. We can just keep printing dollars. This is, I think, modern monetary theory. We can afford whatever we want. What would you say to them?
Well, it's technically right. What you do, technically, the Treasury borrows from the open market, and then the Federal Reserve buys that debt from the bondholder, puts money into the economy, and takes the debt back onto the books of the Fed. So it's no longer owed to the public. The debt is now owed to another unit of the government. But what happens is the money supply has gone up. So it is printing money to finance the war. The problem with that is that, again, you can do it to an extent, but if you do it too much, you get inflation. And in 2021 and 2022, we had a blowout of the money supply. I've been a monetary economist for 43 years. I mentioned international. I never saw it. In fact, it never happened before, such a large increase of the money supply. And then you start having inflation. The first inflation was that every crazy cryptocurrency soared in value. And then the stock market soared in value, and asset prices soared in value, and non-fungible tokens soared in value. But then it got into the commodities markets. Now it's getting into the real, you go to the grocery store, it's into the real economy. And so that's what happens when you print trillions of dollars, which is what we did in 2021, 2022. So you can do it. It's just that you have consequences when you do it. Don't do it and think you're going to get away with it just completely printing money. Lots of governments have tried that for actually a couple millennia. It's called debasing the currency. And you can do it for a little while, but after a while, you better pay your bills. That's the basic point.
Thank you. For those of you who just tuned in, I'm Marcy Winograd for Code Pink Radio. I am with the distinguished Jeffrey Sachs, economist, public policy analyst, who's been doing this for decades, talking about this debt crisis of anywhere from $24 trillion to $31 trillion, and the betrayal of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who promised that he would not deliver a blank check for military spending. And yet, all talk of cutting the military budget has suddenly evaporated during this period in which he is negotiating with President Biden and demanding cuts in Social Security and Medicare, food stamps, and so forth. Jeffrey Sachs.
I wish we heard Biden saying, well, at least we'll cut the military budget. I'm not hearing that either. Neither of them.
No. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, let's say you're in the White House. You're in the Oval Office.
Hard to believe.
I'm going to put you there right now. And you're meeting maybe with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and the Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. And you say, look, this is out of control. This is a debt we have. We need to cut the military budget, slash it. What are you going to cut in that budget?
First thing I'm going to say, God, we thought we were going to bluff Putin and so forth, and just NATO enlargement was going to go on. And he called the bluff. And now we're in this ridiculous, horrible, tragic, destructive, expensive war. We're going to tell him, okay, no NATO enlargement, you go home. In other words, we're going to negotiate the end of this, which started with these provocations of overthrowing a neutral government and overthrowing the sanity of not moving NATO right up to a nearly 2,000 kilometer border with Russia and all that. So I would stop the war through negotiation. That would be the first thing. We'd save a lot of money. Second, I would say, look, we just had the accounting by SIPRI, which is the Stockholm Institute that keeps track of who spends what on the military. The United States is spending more than the next 10 countries combined. And I'm talking about China among those countries. We're spending 3 times China's military spending. We're spending more than the next 10 countries combined. Let's get this under control. Then I would point out that we have 800 military bases abroad. China, 1 or 2, depending on how you count, maybe a small one in Djibouti, maybe 1 or 2 others. We have 800. Okay, we don't need 800 for our security. It's not adding to our security, it's adding to our debt enormously. So let's get this under control. Let's take out an Excel spreadsheet also and do this right. Real numbers, not gimmicks. Let's see what we need to do in taxes, because God, there's so many loopholes here that it's unbelievable. But at the same time, let's stop waste on the, not just waste, tragic spending on the military industrial complex, because that is where we have wasted so much of our money.
Yes. And when we create, I don't like that word, it has a positive connotation, but when we produce, or the military contractors who are really making a killing off of killing, when they produce new weapon systems, these systems emit tremendous greenhouse gases. So there is that connection. And too often we see environmentalists and peace activists operating in silos. And at Code Pink, we have a War is Not Green campaign because we think it's essential that we integrate these campaigns, because the military is a driver of the climate crisis. The Pentagon is the single largest global institutional emitter of greenhouse gases, consumer of oil and fossil fuels, and too much of that is under the radar. So let's talk about it. Now, let's also talk about what we're doing at Code Pink.
Great.
This week and next week. We have grassroots activists on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, Medea Benjamin, Olivia DiNucci, who many people met when she disrupted. Well, she's disrupted a few times those powers that be that insist on all of this never-ending spending for the military, including Joe Biden. So anyway, they're going to be on Capitol Hill with others, visiting key lawmakers' offices and saying, look, this is our petition. Code Pink is a partner in the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, which represents over 100 organizations. We have a petition calling on Biden, Putin, and Zelensky to support a ceasefire and peace negotiations now. And I thank you, Jeffrey Sachs, because you are one of the prominent signers of that petition, along with others such as Noam Chomsky, Daniel Ellsberg, Dr. Cornel West, Ann Wright, Jack Matlock, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, even Roger Waters, the co-founder of Pink Floyd, has signed that, as well as Dennis Kucinich, one of my heroes, who was in Congress for many years and a great peace champion. So we are taking this ceasefire petition not only to offices on Capitol Hill, but also fanning out across the country to deliver it to congressional offices, along with a full-page ad that ran in the New York Times last week. Thank you very much, Eisenhower Media Network. And this ad said, "Let the United States be a force for peace in the world instead of," well, I'm adding this now, "instead of a force for war and destruction." There are those, however, Jeffrey Sachs, there are those who disagree with this call for a ceasefire. They think it's controversial. They say, no, we cannot have a ceasefire because then Putin would end up with this annexed territory in the Donbass and in Crimea. Whether that was an annexation or reunification is certainly up for debate. What would you say to them?
I think it's really important to get to negotiations and to understand the roots of this war. This war came because we kept pushing NATO. And at the end of 2021, Putin put on the table, actually, you want to avoid war, here is a draft Russia-US security treaty. And it had several points, the most important of which is stop the NATO expansion. And you know what the White House said? No way we're going to talk to Russia about NATO expansion. That's our business. It has nothing to do with Russia. Of course it has to do with Russia. We're about to put NATO right up against the Russian border. And so this was calamitously misguided foreign policy in the United States. And it's not just me saying it. The leading American diplomats have been saying this for decades now. Don't do this. George Kennan, William Burns, who's our CIA director right now, warned about this in 2008. And William Perry, who was our Clinton's Secretary of Defense, nearly resigned over Clinton deciding to enlarge NATO because Perry was saying, we're going to start another Cold War with Russia. So it's possible to negotiate. But it's actually been, strangely enough, the United States that has absolutely rejected diplomacy. Americans probably couldn't believe that, but it's actually true. And it's at least two recent occasions. One is at the end of 2021, when Putin was putting a diplomatic initiative on the table. And we said, no, we're not going to talk about it. NATO enlargements, none of your business. That's what we told the Russians. And then at the start of the invasion, just a couple weeks after the invasion, Zelensky said, all right, okay, we could think about neutrality. We should negotiate. Now, I know what happened there because I've spoken to people that were deeply involved in this. Right at the beginning, the Ukrainians said, we could really we don't have to be in NATO. We could have guarantees from other ways. And the Russians said, okay, let's talk. And the Turkish diplomats said, we'll mediate. And so real mediation started. And actually, the former prime minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, got into the act as an informal mediator. Towards the end of March 2022, they actually were working on the draft agreement to end the war. I'm talking about more than a year ago. And the United States said no. The United States said no diplomacy. Nobody questioned that in the mainstream media here, because when's the last time you read in the New York Times a real understanding of this war? It doesn't exist in the New York Times. They just want you to follow what the U.S. government says. And so if the U.S. government says it's all Russia, they don't want to negotiate, okay, then the New York Times will say it's all Russia, they don't want to negotiate. But for those of us who are there watching, seeing, talking, it's so different. We could negotiate this till today, and we're not even trying. And we're not trying because Victoria Nuland doesn't want to try. Every time this issue of negotiation comes up, she says, no, it's not the time. And actually, when General Milley said this is the time for negotiation. It was, I think, it was the Undersecretary of State that said about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. No, he's wrong. This is not the time to negotiate. Come on, let's get serious.
Well, we have at Codeping a campaign, Fire Victoria Nuland, which we released on International Women's Day. It's still on our website. Because we are very aware of what she is up to. Now, you touched on a lot of issues that I'd like to revisit. You mentioned the media, and we have, Ray McGovern, a former CIA analyst. He says it's not the military-industrial complex. Let's see if I can remember this. It's the military-industrial. He calls it the Mickey Mat, and included in that is the congressional complex and the media complex. We see the New York Times. We see the Washington Post constantly producing headlines that would only encourage the warmongers on the Capitol to continue funding this war in Ukraine rather than sit down and negotiate. What personally has been your experience with the New York Times and Washington Post, Jeffrey Sachs? I mean, you're a world-renowned economist. Will they talk to you?
I tried to get a piece in the New York Times recently. They actually accepted it, then they rejected it. I was trying to explain that there were provocations to this war because they have used the word unprovoked about the Russian invasion 26 times by my count. They've done it in their editorials. They've done it in the New York Times columns like Tom Friedman and others. And they've done it in the invited op-ed pieces. So I said to the editors, come on, could you run something that says that there was provocation? Just let me write a few hundred words to put it on the other side. And first the editor said, yeah, we'll accept that. I actually sent in a piece and he edited it. And then they said, no, we're not going to run this thing. So it's very hard right now to have a real discussion in the major mainstream, I'd say pro-Biden media. I think the New York Times, if it was probably against the prevailing administration, would be more critical. I don't think it's just pure dumbing down. I think it's politics. They like Biden, so they don't want to say anything against the Biden administration. And if the Biden administration is part of this war effort, they don't want to talk about it. I think that's really what it is. It's just a kind of pure partisanship, so that they feel, we don't want Trump back, so we're not going to say anything bad about Biden. So, and our readers, they must think, aren't grown up enough to be able to discern any subtleties in this. It's bad, actually. It's very strange. It is strange. I'll tell you, my own view. This is another issue. But I'm a pretty good observer and I talk to a lot of people. And my own view, just to shift topics for a moment, is that the US blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And I explained why I thought so from the start. Then came along Seymour Hersh, who I have to admit is a hero of mine, lifetime hero, because I grew up as a young kid reading his accounts of Vietnam War atrocities and so forth. So I've always loved Seymour, but he gave a very detailed explanation of what happened, the timing, how it was done, and so forth. The New York Times didn't even cover that, didn't even cover it to debunk it. And then there was this almost like a joke. I think it was a joke on the New York Times, actually. They got some somebody from the CIA or someplace or the White House told them it was some people in a yacht. It was 6 people in a boat. That story lasted about 24 hours. I mean, it didn't even last 2 minutes in my view. I thought it was hilarious, not substantive. But the New York Times ran it with a straight face, but they wouldn't run Seymour Hersh's account and then discuss it. So they're not even covering the news and much less challenging a critical thought. And that,
yes, I would
that's
agree.
pretty serious.
The New York Times, the Washington Post, and their coverage of what's happening in Ukraine have really assigned themselves to irrelevancy because they are Pentagon PR flacks who just repeat talking points. And there's no serious investigation into any aspect of this war. And that's why, at Code Pink, we support alternative, non-corporate journalism. Please tell others. Code Pink Radio will tell you the truth. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, let's talk about China a little bit further. Yeah. China has come out with the 12-point peace proposal, which Biden immediately dismissed as, what did he say? He said it was irrational. Frankly, his response was irrational. Meanwhile, we've had actual Code Pink members have met with representatives of China in Washington, D.C. to thank the Chinese government for coming up with this peace plan and for playing a peacemaker's role. I mean, whatever people think about China and whatever criticisms they have, I think we have to be very clear that China, as you mentioned, has maybe one or two overseas bases. It's not a threat militarily, and it is trying to play the role of peacemaker, not just in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine. Do you think that China, the global South, can make a difference here? I mean, because it's not just China, it's Mexico, it's Brazil, it's other countries too that are saying we need a ceasefire. We need it now because they know the security of not just Ukraine and Russia and the United States is at stake, but the security of the entire globe.
First, I think people should understand a basic fact about China. China has not engaged in one overseas war in the last 40 years, while the United States has been engaged in non-stop wars. We keep pointing our finger at China. Look at how militaristic. We vastly outspend China on the military. We have surrounded China with military bases. We've been engaged in constant wars. We are trying right now to break the Chinese economy. And then we point our finger like the G7 did in this recent meeting in just a kind of a hate-filled, ignorant session. Look at how evil China is. Look at how evil China is. It's so low level for anyone who really follows this. I was actually myself in China last month. I've been to China so many times over the last 40 years. We're in a propaganda field right now of anti-China propaganda that has no basis in reality. And we're trying to create an enemy there so we can crush China because they're daring to achieve economic development. So this is the starting point. Now, in terms of China's peace plan, it has one crucial point. And it says that a peace agreement should respect the security interests of all parties. What does that mean? That's code for don't expand NATO, because Russia, understandably, regards that as a direct security threat. To have NATO weapons on Russia's 1,900 kilometer border with Ukraine is not what Russia would like. Just like we would not be thrilled with Russian bases in Mexico or in Canada or any place else nearby. That's what Russia's trying to tell us. China gets it. China just uses very Confucian, if I could say, very nice, orderly words, respect the security interests of all parties. And that means to the United States, would you understand what Russia has been saying to the US since Russia was independent, December 1991? Don't enlarge NATO. And especially since 2008, by God, not to Georgia. Are you kidding? That's what they've been telling us. And China gets it. And that's why Biden immediately rejected it. Because this is a game. The game is Newland's game to expand NATO to Ukraine.
You know, I think a lot of people don't realize, Jeffrey Sachs, that this has been a long time coming, not just in terms of beginning in 2004 with the greatest expansion of NATO, but also in 2020, we had NATO recognize Ukraine as what I call a de facto member with this interoperability agreement saying, we're going to integrate our armed forces. Now, what's the difference between being a de facto member of NATO and an official member of NATO? Well, it could be what you're talking about, bases. It could be nuclear weapons. People say, well, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. First of all, they should all give them up, right? We should be pushing for the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which NATO emphatically opposes. So NATO,
and by the way, if I may just say that under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which we are a major signatory, we are bound to nuclear disarmament, but we're not even trying right now. So we're not even honoring the treaties that we're in, much less joining the treaties that we ought to be joining. So this is a terrible thing. And by the way, that's a huge budget cost. That is hundreds of billions of dollars that we're spending on, quote, modernizing the nuclear weapons rather than negotiating nuclear disarmament. So that's another part to come back to the budget story of the past. Mm-hmm. But this story of NATO goes back actually to the early 1990s. I spoke with a wonderful historian recently who told me that in documents that he is reviewing, he hasn't published yet, Ukraine was already on a list for NATO enlargement in 1992. Now, that's, years before Putin's anywhere around on this. This is a plan that goes back to the neocons with Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld in the Bush administration. So this goes back a lot. And now, interestingly, if you look up, it's a fascinating article. Zbig Brzezinski in 1997 in Foreign Affairs magazine. Mind you, this is before Putin's president by years. In 1997, Zbig Brzezinski spells out the timeline for expanding NATO to Ukraine. And he says almost exactly the sequence as it actually happened, because what he was writing in 1997 was not just his ideas. He was writing what was already in the works inside the government. So this is a story that goes back 25 years at least, and it's been hidden from the American people. And they thought they'd get it on a bluff. The real idea of the United States was, what's Putin going to do? We're going to expand NATO, and what's he going to do? And he's going to complain, and we're going to say it's none of your business, and we're going to expand. And that was really their idea. Then Yanukovych got in the way. Yanukovych, president of Ukraine, who said, no, I don't want Ukraine to be in NATO. That's very dangerous. We'll be neutral. Well, the U.S. helped get rid of him. So this is a long, long story. None of it told honestly to the American people. And then if you say it now that this had something to do with the war, try to get it published in the New York Times. You can't.
Jeffrey, people say, I've heard this over and over again, and they quote different people, unnamed people, I won't give them the credit here. They say, look, the reason why Putin has not invaded Poland, let's say, is because Poland is a member of NATO. So Ukraine needs this protection. If Ukraine were a member, an official, not just a de facto or interoperability member of NATO, then Putin never would have invaded.
That's possible. But you know what? The way we did it, we virtually guaranteed a war. Period. In other words, to say, okay, Ukraine, you're going to join NATO, and the Russians are saying against our border, no. And then as this occurred, they said, you keep pushing this, we're going to have war. And the war started in 2014 because the safety for Ukraine was when Ukraine was saying, we don't even want it. Stop. Don't get us into the middle of this war between the two of you. So the fact of the matter is this: NATO enlargement was completely unnecessary. and provocative all the way back to the 1990s.
And then we saw in 2019,
but just
Ukraine
to say,
embedded in its constitution this vow to join NATO.
Just to say, even the first round, which was Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, the Russians hated it, but it didn't cause a war. That's far from their borders. Then the next round came, and the Russians were really, really annoyed because that one was on their border with the Baltics. So it was Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And then they said, oh, come on, will you stop? Then in 2007, Putin said, okay, you've done it. You keep expanding NATO. You promised you wouldn't, but you keep doing it. Stop. Do not come up to our border with Ukraine and Georgia. And by the way, people should take a map out and understand a little bit about this. The real goal of these neocons, the Nuland neocons, is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. This is why, where does Georgia come in here? I don't mean Atlanta, Georgia. I mean Georgia, the country in the Caucasus. Where's that come from? If you look at a map, the idea of these neocons is that you have Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And Putin saying, don't do this, stop. And he says this in 2007. Then in 2008, Bush pushes this, and Nuland is key member of the administration then. And they push this over the opposition of the Europeans and get the Bucharest NATO declaration to declare that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, will. And by the way, Biden has been part of this all along. And the military-industrial complex has pushed this. The literal lobbies for NATO enlargement have been Raytheon people. I mean, you can't make this up. This is how the U.S. government works.
Lastly,
Raytheon,
Jeffrey Sachs, yes. I want to ask you about Ukraine and the future of Ukraine. Should we continue on this calamitous path of endless war, propping up the Ukrainian government to the tune of $6 billion a month, spending over $115 billion to continue the war, half of that going to military contractors for weapons and military training. Meanwhile, what's going to happen to the Ukrainian economy? Because we've already read about Zelensky privatizing a lot of these industries that were nationalized under the Soviet Union. And we know that representatives of BlackRock have been over in Ukraine. And we know that Zelensky has a website. And on the website, there's a menu for privatizing Ukraine and inviting investors to, invest in the military in Ukraine. Where do you see this going? Should we continue on this course?
Look, Ukraine is being destroyed. The first tragedy is for Ukraine itself. Being a place where the U.S. wages a proxy war is the worst place you can be. As Kissinger famously said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend can be fatal. We are killing Ukraine. Literally, we're killing Ukrainians, but we're killing Ukraine. Think of how we loved Afghanistan, how we love South Vietnam. What do we do? Iraq. If you are the place where the U.S. is waging a proxy war, first of all, you will be physically destroyed. You will have mass outmigration of young people, of talented people, of people just trying to survive, for God's sake. You'll have your infrastructure destroyed. All of this, the Ukrainian economy is busted, and the Ukrainian population has shrunk tremendously because people have left the country. And so this is in no way helping Ukraine. This is just, I tried to tell the Ukrainians, I'm for you. I'm not against you. They kept thinking, oh, that's Putin propaganda. I said, no, listen, I go back to the Vietnam War in the United States, to Iraq, Afghanistan. I've seen what happens when the U.S. grabs you in a proxy war. And this is what's happening right now to Ukraine. It's being tragically destroyed. And every time things don't work, our side ratchets up, and they keep ratcheting up. And sad to say, Obama knew in 2014, he got the main point when he said and realized that Russia has what's called escalatory dominance. What that means is Russia can meet us and raise the bet. Because for Russia, this is existential. For us, it's another war. Okay, we're going to expand NATO here. We're going to expand NATO there. We're going to do whatever we want to do. For Russia, they view this as the essence of Russia's national security. They have 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. Obama realized this, said, I don't want to even start down this path. I don't know what this administration is doing. They have no plan. It's phony. And phony in the sense that they have no route to success, but they're in it up to their necks right now. Worse than that, for Ukraine, they're in it above their heads. They're drowning in this violence. We've got to stop the fighting, because there is no military path to victory, because Russia can escalate, and can escalate to devastation. And we're told, oh, don't say that, don't mention nuclear weapons and so forth. You know what? Mention them. Understand.
Yes, and I think we should also mention, Jeffrey Sachs, that the United States has a nuclear posture review. The Biden administration says we will use nuclear weapons first if our allies' interests are threatened. So, who's going to use them first, or will they be used? All of this is speculation, but it's frightening that we are escalating right now, training Ukrainians on F-16 fighter jets that could
after they said again
Russia.
And again that they wouldn't do it, they keep taking the next step. It's time for the Nuland administration really to step down so that we can have peace and have some sanity.
With that, I want to thank you, Jeffrey Sachs, world-renowned economist, public policy analyst, author, prolific author, for your time on Code Pink Radio. Here's to peace. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you so much. Great to be with you.